Remember, you're dreaming.
Night Terror, also known as Eye for an Eye, is directed by Colin Tilley and tells the story of a young woman who goes to live with her blind grandmother after the death of her parents in a car accident. And she moves from New York to Florida to go and live with her grandmother in this kind of out of the way sort of in a sort of swampy area. And she ends up meeting these kind of two other people who are kind of at a similar age to her, who are, in fact, one of them at least is very much a bully and bullies this kind of little boy and ends up injuring him. And there happens to be this kind of urban legend within this kind of community. In fact, the grandmother was actually a victim of it, of this creature, this entity called the Sleepwalker or the Sandman. And this creature basically avenges bullied individuals, and kind of gets revenge. And now, because she was friends with these kind of two individuals, then this person who was bullied kind of associates her with them, and she didn't really kind of say anything. She is now targeted along with the other two when the Sandman comes to get his revenge. What will happen? You'll have to watch the movie and find out. So let's discuss what works in this movie. So this is quite a polished sort of style horror film. One thing I would say this movie's biggest strength is the antagonist, this Sandman creature. Very creepy. They've created an extraordinarily creepy villain, I guess you want to say, who is sympathetic, if we're being honest, but nonetheless a very macabre individual, you might say. And the way this Sandman is created, he's not especially attacking you, but he's just kind of lurking. And the design of him, I think, is absolutely fantastic. And he kind of is made of an emaciated boy with no eyes, and he's all sort of covered in roots. It's really kind of quite affecting, I have to say. Really kind of, I think, quite a eerie and ominous looking individual, and makes some very kind of creepy moments where he's just kind of hanging around and sort of silently just kind of standing there. I think this is the movie's biggest strength. I will say, I think our main actress is pretty likeable and, a fairly sort of, decent actress. Makes for a likeable sort of character who ends up kind of falling in with the wrong crowd and everything. It has a kind of southern gothic charm. The grandmother, I think, is kind of an interesting character because she was the victim of the Sandman when she was younger, and she has a kind of rivalry with her sister, and it's hinted that maybe the sister, so the young woman's great aunt, maybe had summoned it. And there's some interesting things that I think happen with the grandmother character. Certainly when the Sandman comes back, she assumes that it's kind of to do with her, but it isn't. But that was some sort of quite good, interesting kind of family dynamics. It's one of these movies where I really wanted to see an after, what happened after the movie with the kind of the police and stuff. I won't say what happens in the end, obviously, but I would be what are the police going to make about this, effectively? So it's quite sort of polished and, a reasonable kind of production value. The kind of there are some directorial flourishes. A lot of this movie is before the Sandman ultimately comes for your eyes, which is what his MO is. He ends up sort of putting his victims into a series of nightmares, and there's some quite inventive direction when it comes to these sort of nightmare sequences, using kind of interesting kind of camera techniques to give you a feeling of disorientation and that kind of thing. So, there's some interesting concepts in regards to these kind of nightmares, and we sort of learn some of the kind of like the fears that these young people have, and this obviously kind of comes back to kind of haunt them. And so there's some kind of interesting and inventive sort of sequences involving these kind of nightmare sort of sequences. So I thought that they were all kind of quite quite creative in many ways. What doesn't work, the main thing with this story is it very much feels like a studio horror. There's like no risks, you know, it really is a very, very simple storyline where you can kind of just, you know, connect the dots super easy. It's very much what you're going to expect in regards to this kind of story. No surprises whatsoever. You know, we have our trio of young people, including our main protagonist and having two new friends, and particularly the guy is like, you know, a real a-hole. So you know that he's going to kind of get it, and then, you know, our protagonist is going to be the kind of the last one standing and stuff, and she is really the good person, so to speak. But there's no surprises. It's a very generic story, I have to say. And outside of the Sandman character himself, and I think maybe the grandma, everyone else is somewhat of a generic character. Like I say, these two river rats, the two friends that she makes, typical kind of like white trashy types. You know, it's very sort of typical. There's not a particularly kind of high body count in this movie. It's not really a scary movie. It is an eerie movie, I think, thanks to the design of the Sandman creature, but it's not a scary film in any way. I have to say as well, a problem I have with this one is that it's so obvious about what's going to happen, and you're just waiting for this Sandman to attack these three young people. And you know our main protagonist is going to be the last one because she's the main character. So when we kind of go to these nightmare sequences, you're almost feeling this is just a preamble, because we're told that the Sandman infects you with kind of like vivid nightmares before he ultimately attacks. So although I think the nightmare sequences are quite inventive, you're just kind of spinning your wheels inevitably, because you know it's a nightmare and you know that ultimately it's just going to lead to this attack, but you've got to sit through this kind of nightmare sequence until you get there. So it really feels redundant in some ways, I have to say. And I have to say as well, although again I appreciate some of the kind of the visual stylings of the nightmare sequences, I think they go on a little bit too long at times, or there's too many of them, because you know that you're just sort of waiting for the inevitable attack to happen, so you've almost just got to get through these kind of nightmare sequences until ultimately you get to the actual attack of this creature. And even with them, you know that our two kind of friends are going to be the cannon fodder, whilst our main character is going to be the one to fight back. So the story is incredibly obvious and kind of basic. Now, to rate this movie, I would say this is a very run-of-the-mill horror movie. However, I will say, because of the design of this Sandman creature, and I just think he was so eerie looking, I will say that his sequences, when he is present, and he's not really there in the nightmare sequences, to be honest with you, but when he is there, you do get a good, like, creepy vibe. So to me, that pushes it to a slightly above average score. But other than that, it is very much just business as usual, and elevated slightly by a very, very macabre central antagonist. So I'll give it a 6 out of 10. Have you seen it? Would you see it? Please do let me know your thoughts, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.